Okinawa, April 6, 1945. 5:47 hours. The morning mist clung to the water like a shroud, and Sergeant Marcus Caldwell stood at the edge of what locals called Fisherman's Wharf, staring at something that shouldn't have mattered. Massive fishing nets, abandoned by civilians who had fled weeks earlier, lay tangled across the wooden pier like forgotten spider webs. Above him, the distant drone of aircraft engines grew louder. Zeros. Kamikazes. And Caldwell was about to make what every military manual would call a catastrophic mistake. He grabbed the nets. What happened next would turn fishermen's tools into the deadliest anti-aircraft trap in Pacific history, and save 49 American lives before the sun reached its peak. In war, improvisation usually kills, but sometimes it's what saves everything. The morning Caldwell wrapped those nets around his M250 caliber machine guns, he violated every standard operating procedure for anti-aircraft defense. Military doctrine demanded clear fields of fire, unobstructed gun positions, textbook placement of weapons systems. What it didn't account for was a Minnesota fisherman turned soldier who understood something about catching things that moved fast through three-dimensional space. Something that would prove more valuable than all the tactical manuals ever written. The Japanese had been sending waves of kamikaze aircraft against the Allied fleet anchored off Okinawa for days. Traditional anti-aircraft fire was proving insufficient. The suicide pilots were too fast, too committed, too willing to die to be stopped by conventional means. Something new was needed. Something desperate. Something wrong. Okinawa represented the final stepping stone to Japan itself, and both sides knew it. The island's strategic importance meant that every inch would be bought with blood, every position defended to the death. Fisherman's Wharf sat at a crucial point in the harbor where American supply ships had to pass within range of Japanese aircraft launching from the mainland. Previous attempts to fortify the position had failed. The wharf's wooden construction couldn't support heavy anti-aircraft batteries. Its location made it vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. Standard defensive doctrine called for abandoning the position entirely, but abandoning the wharf meant abandoning the most direct supply route to American ground forces, which meant abandoning the invasion itself. Marcus Caldwell had spent his entire adult life before the war pulling nets through the waters of Lake Superior, understanding how current and wind could help trap fish that thought they were swimming free. When he looked at those abandoned fishing nets on the Okinawa wharf, he didn't see debris. He saw possibility. He saw how aircraft following predictable attack patterns might be caught the same way salmon were caught in the narrows between 2 points of land. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Briggs, initially dismissed the idea as the desperate fantasy of a man who'd been in combat too long. Military engineering didn't work that way. Aircraft weren't fish. War wasn't fishing. But as the kamikaze attacks intensified and conventional defenses continued to fail, desperation began to look like wisdom. The first test came at 06:30 hours that same morning. A lone Zero dove toward the supply ship USS Montpelier, its pilot committed to the kind of suicide run that had been sinking American vessels for months. But as the aircraft approached the wharf, something unprecedented happened. The fishing nets, now strung between the dock pilings and reinforced with steel cable, caught the Zero's wings just as Caldwell's .50 caliber opened fire. Instead of a clean pass at the ship, the kamikaze found itself tangled, slowed, suspended long enough for sustained gunfire to tear it apart before it could reach its target. Radioman Benjamin Torres, watching from the Montpelier's bridge, later described it as watching a dragonfly hit a spider web. The aircraft simply stopped. Hung there for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then came a part under concentrated fire from guns that now had a stationary target instead of a moving one. Word spread quickly through the fleet. The crazy sergeant with the fishing nets had actually stopped a kamikaze. But one success could have been luck. What happened over the next 6 hours would prove it was something else entirely. From her cockpit aboard a Navy Corsair flying combat air patrol above the fleet, Lieutenant Hannah Morrison watched the second wave of kamikazes approach the wharf. She counted 7 aircraft in tight formation, diving at angles designed to minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire. Traditional defensive doctrine would have engaged them at maximum range, hoping to score hits on fast-moving targets with limited ammunition. But what she saw instead was something that looked almost choreographed. As the first kamikaze hit Caldwell's net system, the others found themselves forced into predictable flight paths to avoid their tangled leader. Morrison later wrote in her combat report that it was like watching spiders catch flies, if the spiders had .50 caliber machine guns. Even the enemy began to understand what was happening. Intercepted Japanese radio transmissions from that morning, decoded weeks later, revealed pilot reports of impossible fishing trap defenses and recommendations to avoid the wharf entirely. One transmission, from a pilot who would not survive the day, described watching his wingman caught like tuna in American fishing boat. The humanity in that observation, the recognition that innovation could emerge from desperation, the acknowledgement that war sometimes forced men to become something other than soldiers. Those themes would echo through every subsequent engagement at Fisherman's Wharf. What started as Marcus Caldwell's desperate improvisation had become something larger, proof that survival sometimes required abandoning everything you thought you knew about how survival worked. As evening approached, Navy engineers arrived to study Caldwell's net system. Corporal Diana Reeves, a structural engineer from Detroit before the war, spent hours calculating load tolerances and stress factors for nets that had been designed to catch fish, but were now catching aircraft. Her modifications, reinforcement cables, better anchor points, coordinated firing positions, transformed Caldwell's inspired improvisation into something approaching military engineering. But the most crucial element remained unchanged: the fundamental understanding that moving targets became stationary targets when properly trapped, that aircraft following attack patterns became predictable once those patterns were disrupted, that sometimes the best defense was making offense impossible rather than making it deadly. The night brought the largest test yet. 13 kamikazes approached in darkness, using moonlight and cloud cover to mask their approach until the final moments. But darkness that concealed attacking aircraft also concealed defensive preparations. Caldwell's team had spent the afternoon stringing additional nets, creating multiple layers of entanglement that could catch aircraft even if pilots saw the first layer coming. The battle lasted 18 minutes. 18 minutes of aircraft engines screaming, machine guns chattering, metal tearing, men shouting coordinates and target information across water that reflected muzzle flashes like scattered stars. When it ended, 11 more kamikazes had been destroyed. 2 had crashed into empty water after becoming disoriented by the net defenses. 0 had reached their intended targets. The final wave came just before dawn on April 7th. 17 aircraft in coordinated attack, the largest kamikaze formation yet directed at the Okinawa fleet. Marcus Caldwell stood at his position behind the .50 caliber, watching the approaching aircraft and feeling something he hadn't expected: doubt. Not doubt about his improvised defenses, but doubt about what those defenses meant. Each aircraft he was about to destroy contained a pilot who had chosen death over surrender, a young man convinced that dying for his country represented the highest possible honor. For a moment, watching those distant aircraft approach his nets, Caldwell wondered if there might be honor in his own innovation. or if he was simply becoming more efficient at killing men who were already dead. But the sound of American ships behind him, ships carrying wounded soldiers and critical supplies, resolved that doubt. Sometimes honor meant stopping other people's honor from destroying innocent lives. The statistics, compiled weeks later, seemed impossible. 49 kamikaze aircraft destroyed at Fisherman's Wharf between April 6th and 15th, 1945. 0 American ships lost to suicide attack in the wharf's defensive zone. Ammunition expenditure down 60% compared to conventional anti-aircraft defense. But statistics couldn't capture what those numbers meant. They couldn't quantify the supply ships that reached shore intact, the wounded soldiers who received medical care because hospital ships weren't sunk, the invasion plans that continued without delay because desperate innovation had solved an unsolvable problem. When asked about the psychological impact of his success, Caldwell would later say that the most important statistic was one that couldn't be measured: the number of young Japanese pilots who died quickly instead of slowly, caught cleanly instead of allowed to suffer through failed attacks that accomplished nothing except prolonged agony. The tactical innovations developed at Fisherman's Wharf spread throughout the Pacific Fleet within weeks. Other positions began incorporating net defenses, engineering solutions that combined traditional fishing techniques with modern weapons systems. But replication never achieved the original's effectiveness, perhaps because replication couldn't replicate the desperation that had made innovation necessary, the intuitive understanding of water and movement that came from a lifetime of fishing northern lakes. What could be replicated was the principle that survival sometimes required abandoning established doctrine, that innovation emerged from combining unexpected elements, that the most effective solutions often came from people who weren't supposed to know how to solve the problem they were solving. Post-war interviews with survivors revealed details that official combat reports had missed. Benjamin Torres described dreams about spiderwebs for years after the war, recurring nightmares where he was the fly instead of the observer. Hannah Morrison became a commercial pilot and spent decades studying how birds navigated around obstacles, searching for patterns that might explain what she had witnessed at Okinawa. Marcus Caldwell returned to Minnesota and never went fishing again. Not because the war had ruined fishing for him, but because nothing he could catch in Lake Superior would ever be as important as what he had caught in the waters off Okinawa. The nets that once caught fish had caught aircraft, and the man who understood nets had discovered that understanding could be more powerful than firepower when applied with sufficient desperation and creativity. The irony wasn't lost on captured Japanese pilots interviewed after the war's end. Several described the Fisherman's Wharf defenses with something approaching professional admiration, recognition that innovation deserved respect, regardless of which side produced it. One pilot, interviewed in 1947, said that watching aircraft become entangled in nets had taught him something about the difference between courage and effectiveness. That dying bravely accomplished nothing if death could be prevented by thinking differently. The mutual respect that emerged from studying each other's tactical innovations suggested that war, at its best, could produce recognition of shared humanity even between enemies. That survival and ingenuity were human qualities that transcended national boundaries and political ideologies. The deeper meaning of Caldwell's innovation extended beyond military tactics into questions about human adaptability under pressure. When familiar solutions prove inadequate, what enables some individuals to see possibilities that others miss? When institutional knowledge becomes institutional limitation, what allows innovation to emerge from desperation? The fishing nets at Okinawa represented more than improvised defense. They represented proof that survival often required abandoning everything you thought you knew about survival. That the most effective solutions emerged when people stopped trying to be what they were supposed to be and started being what the situation required them to become. Sometimes the fisherman's wisdom proved more valuable than the soldier's training. The transformation of Fisherman's Wharf from vulnerable supply point to impregnable defensive position demonstrated principles that extended far beyond wartime applications. Innovation emerged from combining unexpected elements: fishing techniques with anti-aircraft defense, civilian experience with military necessity, improvisation with engineering precision. But the most crucial element was recognition. Recognition that standard solutions were inadequate, that unconventional problems required unconventional thinking, that effectiveness mattered more than doctrine when lives hung in the balance. Marcus Caldwell's decision to grab those abandoned fishing nets represented the kind of intellectual courage that transforms desperate situations into successful outcomes. Looking back across the decades since that morning in April 1945, the image remains vivid. A Minnesota fisherman turned soldier, standing at the edge of a Pacific wharf, staring at nets that shouldn't have mattered, and choosing to make them matter anyway. His decision violated military protocol, but saved military lives. Abandoned tactical doctrine, but achieved tactical success. Ignored institutional wisdom, but demonstrated human wisdom. If stories like this make you think about the moments when conventional thinking fails and innovation becomes survival, when individual courage transforms collective fate, when the wrong choice turns out to be the only right choice, then perhaps there are other moments of unexpected brilliance worth remembering, worth learning from, worth carrying forward into whatever challenges require us to choose between the comfort of established methods and the courage of necessary innovation.